UFP, the United Federation of Podcasts.
Stand by to receive our transmission.
You're listening to Star Trek Weekly News. I'm Tony Robinson. In this week's news, we have a short 2018 roundup. A close look at the Picard series. All this and more coming right up. Well, here we are, it's New Year's Eve, and the year is coming to an end, so we're going to take a look back at the top 8 Star Trek news stories of 2018. We'll look at news items that led to bigger things, the questions that remain, and those we lost. Andrew DePledge of Red Shirts Always Die has put together his top 8 Star Trek news stories of 2018. Overall, 2018 was a pretty big one for Star Trek. We saw the culmination of the first Star Trek series to be launched since 2005's Star Trek Enterprise, a number of behind-the-scenes changes, some new faces, returning characters, several more new series announced, and one new series launched. We thought it would be fun to recount the top news items from the year, give updates you may have missed, and even jump into a few stories we missed along the way. We'll also talk about where some rumours went and about the members of the Star Trek family who left us. But let's start with a fun piece of scientific news from September 2018, a story we all missed out on. The planet Vulcan has been found for real. As covered by StarTrek.com on September 19, 2018, the Dharma Planet Survey discovered an exoplanet classified as a super-Earth located just 16 light-years away from Earth, making it not only the closest planet of this type to us, but also in the exact location that had been referred to canonically in Star Trek, meaning Vulcan had been located, but for real. As for whether the Vulcan people are on the planet, I doubt we'll find out anytime soon, but wouldn't it be exciting if it was inhabited? Star Trek Discovery showrunners out and a new 5-year mission. Despite being viewed by many as a huge success and garnering 5 Saturn Award nominations, Star Trek Discovery had a bit of turmoil behind the scenes, with its original showrunner having previously left the series, citing creative differences. They would go on to lose his replacements a short time later, due to allegations that they had created and fueled a hostile work environment. This situation, of course, in some ways mirrors the early days of Star Trek The Next Generation, which itself was fraught with behind-the-scenes issues ranging from trouble with writers to trouble with Gene Roddenberry himself, and led to more than one cast member looking to leave the franchise for good. Fortunately, in both cases, cooler heads would come out on top, with The Next Generation likely on the shorter end of the stick, with Rick Berman coming to power. And in the case of Discovery, long-time Trek fan, collaborator, and by all accounts good guy, Alex Kurtzman would sign a 5-year deal to head up all things Star Trek for CBS. As part of Kurtzman's stewardship of the Star Trek brands, he was able to bring Commander Riker himself back to the franchise, albeit as a director for episodes of Star Trek Discovery. But he didn't stop there. More of the old crew would return, but we'll talk more about that a little later in this episode. The Kelvin Timeline edition of Star Trek IV. If Star Trek IV is the voyage home, it's getting there on thrusters only, because While there's been from Quentin Tarantino directing to cast members speculating to Tarantino's speculating to Paramount talking multiple movies in development and even the hiring of the first female director in franchise history, hard to believe, in S.J. Clarkson. But unfortunately, the stories of hope and expansion would ultimately give way to reports that talks with the Kirk family, on-screen father and son, Chris Hemsworth and Chris Pine, had fallen apart due to a dispute over compensation. And hopes remain, but speculation has turned to whether or not there's any way of saving the Kelvin timeline at all. Star Trek fandom remains strong. For the third consecutive year, Trekkies held a strong spot on the Fandom 250 rankings, showing that even after all these years, our collective voices are loud and proud. In fact, fan outpouring even led to the release of archived, unedited copies of parts of Star Trek Deep Space Nine for digital remastering to HD for use in a crowdfunding documentary due to be released in 2019. Add to that the growing size of Star Trek The Cruise, which we recently learned would be headlined in 2020 by Captain Janeway herself, Kate Mulgrew. And there's no denying that our collective edge as fans remains as sharp as ever. Spock and Pike returning to television? With the end of Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery came the surprise appearance of the USS Enterprise NCC-1701. While we knew it was out there with Captain Christopher Pike, Number 1 and Science Officer Spock aboard, and we had wondered since the first announcement of the show if we'd see it, never did we imagine that it would happen that soon. Discovery cast Anson Mount in the role of Captain Pike, and it quickly became clear that we'd be seeing at least a young version of Spock in flashback form. There was even brief speculation that the Kelvin timeline's Zachary Quinto may reprise his role for the show, but the news eventually came that Ethan Peck has been cast in the role of Spock. And almost inevitably, we lost some of our favourite Star Trek creators and actors. With any franchise that continues over half a century comes inevitable losses, and unfortunately, due to the scope and size of this particular franchise, the list is quite long every year, so apologies up front that it's incomplete, but here's a few of those we lost this year. Writer, producer, and Hugo Award nominee John D.F. Black, who worked on many series including Star Trek and Star Trek The Next Generation. Writer Harlan Ellison, who wrote the classic episode City on the Edge of Forever. Director Robert Scherer, who directed 14 episodes between The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine and Voyager. Actor David Ogden Stiers, who appeared as Dr. Timothy in the Next Generation episode Half a Life. Writer Michael Bischoff, who worked on several Next Generation episodes including Tin Man. And physicist Stephen Hawking, who remains the only actor to play himself in the Star Trek franchise, and who inevitably had a massive impact on the series. And several new series joined the family. With the Alex Kurtzman deal to bring forward new versions of Star Trek, we saw a sudden influx of rumours, new ideas, and ultimately a few brought to fruition. Star Trek Short Treks premiered in October with Runaway, a short format episode highlighting a single character. With 3 episodes now aired and the 4th coming in early January, the new series looks promising so far. The big surprise was the announcement made on October 25 when CBS announced a return to the world of animated Star Trek with the comedy series Star Trek Lower Decks to be helmed by Rick and Morty veteran Mike McMahon. And while we still have no firm dates, common thought is that it will premiere in 2019. And as previously mentioned on Star Trek Weekly News, rumours of Patrick Stewart coming back to Star Trek. At the beginning of the year, there were rumours that Sir Patrick may have been in talks to join the cast of Discovery, which would later follow with speculation that he may have been in talks to reprise his role as Captain Jean-Luc Picard in a limited mini-series. It wasn't too long before we learned that not only would he reprise his role, but it would be in the format of a multi-season, untitled Star Trek Picard series, which will examine the next phase of his life, 20 years after the events of Star Trek The Next Generation. Speculation about what the next chapter of his life may look like quickly followed, and while exact story details have yet to be released, we do know the late 2019 release date on CBS All Access. The series has already received the fan trailer treatment, and speculation about whether iconic roles such as Data will need to be recast, and even the top 10 candidates who might be suited to take on the role. And so we look forward to 2019. It certainly was an action-packed year for the Star Trek franchise, and with Season 2 of Star Trek Discovery, the last episode of Season 1 of Star Trek Short Tracks, the expected release late in the year of the untitled Star Trek Picard series, and the possible release of Star Trek Lower Decks, it looks like we have an even more action-packed year ahead. So, as we heard in a previous episode, Captain Picard is coming back. Elliot Thorpe for Red Shirts Always Die has asked the question, what will the new Picard series bring us? Some fans bemoan the fact that a Star Trek prequel series cannot or shouldn't work due to the very nature of its setting. We know what happens in the fictional future, so where is the drama leading up to that point? Well, for all its highs and lows, Enterprise did work. Yes, it may have played a little with established continuity, but its heart was in the right place. Likewise, Discovery, which garnered controversy even before it started. And I admit, with it looking more at home in the Kelvin timeline than the Prime one did, makes me initially hesitant. But as I did with Enterprise, I put my fears to one side and jumped in feet first, and I'm glad I did. At last, we'll be getting a Star Trek series that we fans have clamoured for a very long time. Not specifically a Picard-centric show, yet we can't deny having Sir Patrick Stewart back on our screens means all our Christmases have come at once, but a show set post-TNG, post-DS9, post-Voyager. A sequel series. So what will it contain? Where will the character of Picard be? What will he be doing? Will he be the Federation ambassador to Vulcan that the official comic book prequel to 2009's Star Trek dictated he becomes? If that is the case, then it will nicely cement the Kelvin timeline as a bona fide version of the Star Trek canon. However, a series set in the past has a blank slate, a missing chapter to play with. Yes, it needs to fit certain parameters, follow certain rules to make sense of what we know comes after, but it can be whatever it wants. And the same applies to a sequel series. But can it be said that a sequel series, especially one that follows such a complex core of past story threads, can easily acknowledge what has come before? And what of the Dominion War that made up the majority of the latter seasons of DS9? And surely Starfleet would see mileage in finding Sisko, science overruling mysticism to discover where one of their senior officers went. Would they have considered him abducted by an omnipotent alien race? Would they invest in appointing one of their most celebrated Starfleet officers, namely one Jean-Luc Picard, to look into this? In any case, will there be some reference to the rebuilding of Cardassia Prime? We might even have the series' proper name being revealed as Keeping Up with the Cardassians. Will Picard be set after the point when Ambassador Spock disappeared? Again, a link to the Kelvin movies. Will that disappearance be referenced? If it is set before, will the continuing movements of the reunification of Vulcan and Romulus be a major plot thread? And will Ethan Peck appear as an older Spock to support